Good afternoon, or actually good morning, almost the afternoon. My name is Susan Jennings. I'm Executive Director of the Arthur Morgan Institute for Community Solutions, and I'm so glad to see so many of you still here on Sunday. We've had 2.5 really full days, lots of amazing presentations. And I'm especially excited today to welcome David Van Tassel and Abbi Han from the Land Institute, who are going to be speaking about their work there. The Land Institute was founded in 1976 by Dana and Wes Jackson, and they've been really taking the lead in the development of perennial grains. It's in Salina, Kansas, and David Van Tassel there has been using classical plant breeding to develop new perennial grain crops for over 20 years. His focus in the last 10 years has been the domestication of the prairie perennial Silphium integrifolium, a deep-rooted and drought tolerant relative of sunflower that could produce similar edible seeds and oil. And we're especially interested in Silphium here at Agraria because the Land Institute was kind enough to share with us several plantings which we have in research plots at Agraria. So we're excited to see what happens with them and to hear David speak about that. Abbi worked at the Land Institute as a summer intern during her undergraduate program in agriculture at Virginia Tech. She returned to Kansas as one of the Land Institute's new research residents after graduating in 2019. David and Abbi will be talking about the work of the Land Institute to develop new perennial crops that can vaccinate land against soil erosion, pollinator decline, and other threats, a truly systems-based approach. They will also discuss the race to develop perennial rice, wheat, and sorghum, and to domesticate wild perennials as staple foods. There will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and I'm sure folks here, since we have such a literate plant bunch, I'm sure we'll have a lot of great questions. So please put your questions in the chat as they occur to you, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of their presentation. Welcome, David and Abbi.
Thank you very much, Susan. Just trying to make sure that we have shared this correctly. Are you seeing?
Yes, it's good.
Okay.
Although you may want to do the slideshow, which you know.
Right.
Oh, it's behind that thing. It's coming.
And then we'll switch to display. Okay.
Does that look good? All right, thank you. All right, well, thanks so much for this opportunity. I'm David, as you may have figured out, not Abbi. And I've been giving talks about my work as an agronomist and geneticist at the Land Institute for over 20 years. And sometimes it feels like it's a talk that's become worn out. And so I hope you'll forgive me if I take this opportunity to shamelessly exploit the pandemic, as serious as it is, to give myself a chance to try to think about a new way to talk about our work. Abbi speaks much better Chinese than I do, but I think I actually spent more time in China than she did because I lived in Hong Kong from the age of 1 to 18. That's where I grew up, and my brother still lives there. So I have deep connections to China. We grew up in one of the most densely populated cities on the planet, but I had always, ever since I was a child, I raised plants in pots on the flat roof of our apartment building. So I've been a plant fanatic, I guess, almost as long as I can remember. For example, we had typhoons in Hong Kong that would, almost destroy the jungle basically. And one time there was a lot of bamboo that had fallen down, and I, as a teenager, figured out how to cut it up into pieces and then plant it and get it to root. And I went back many, many years later and found that there was a nice grove of bamboo outside that apartment building where I had planted those pieces of bamboo. So anyway, from there, how did I get here? Well, was long interested in agricultural development, international agricultural development, and I even visited some projects in Africa in college, and knew people working in that area, and came to realize that I just couldn't go tell farmers who'd been farming all their lives as a city boy how to do it right, because I didn't know what to do. And they, you know, increasingly it's clear that not anyone really knows what to do, and certainly not city kids. And so I went ahead and got a PhD in botany, and then tried to get back into agriculture with the realization that we need to fix North American agriculture first before we have any hope of providing a good example to people in other countries. And so that was my goal in coming to the Land Institute, was to figure out ways for us to reinvent our own agriculture, and then hopefully to spread some of those ideas to the world. What else was I going to say? Well, I guess finally, it's been a dream for me. I didn't know about plant breeding as a kid, or even in college. I didn't know that was really a thing, but it's just been a perfect career for me, because I get to use science and genetics, but I also get to just hang out with plants all day, every day. So to me, it's been a wonderful career, and I've had the privilege of being able to try something new that hasn't been tried before, and it's really fun. So Abbi Han is next to me and is going to introduce herself.
Hi, so like Susan said, I graduated last year from Virginia Tech. I got my degree in crop and soil science with a concentration in plant breeding, which is what brought me here originally. And like David, I also grew up in the city. I grew up 3 miles outside of Washington, D.C. in Arlington, Virginia. And my parents' careers really shaped sort of my understanding of the world today. They both worked in the US Congress for many years, and also in international human rights. And so ironically, I really formed my sense of or understanding of power through my younger exposure to this world, but I also really hated it. So I hated politics and conflict and arguing. So I attempted to run away from that by studying agriculture. And so because I had this idea in my head that science and agriculture was apolitical. But since then I've learned that that's not true, and that conflict and tension are not things to run away from. So that is sort of what is guiding me now in my exploration of plant breeding and figuring out what needs to change within this field to create more equitable seed networks that address these power imbalances. So you can go to the next slide. We wanted to try and describe our work at the Land Institute by describing some of the parallels between what we've seen during this COVID-19 pandemic to compare to a sort of different type of pandemic that is soil erosion. So one of this COVID-19 pandemic has been a very stark illustration of these power and resource inequities within the US, especially. We've seen that how people who are unable to work from home and have essential jobs, people who don't have health insurance, people who aren't taken seriously by doctors, suffer disproportionately compared to those with privilege. And so one solution or tool that people have been talking about a lot is a vaccine in order to mitigate these impacts of the pandemic. So we wanted to compare our technology that we're trying to develop here at TLI, perennial grains, to vaccinate the land against soil erosion or soil loss. So for those who aren't familiar with perennials, perennial grains are grain crops that contrast with annual crops in that they live in the ground year-round for 3 or more years and provide a harvest each year. So The idea is to basically conserve as much topsoil as possible. So David is going to talk more about these parallels.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. So yeah, let indulge us as we build up this maybe contrived simile, I guess, between the pandemic and what we see as a pandemic in soil degradation. So the COVID pandemic, I think we all know it's global in scope. It's extremely destructive to the economies. It's disrupted a lot of our lives and culture, and of course has killed many people. But much less in the news is an ongoing epidemic of soil degradation that's been going on for about as long as agriculture has existed, but for thousands of years for sure. And it's similar in severity and scope. So it's global. It can utterly render land unusable for agriculture, can basically kill soil. And so we think it's a fair comparison. And this map just shows that no part of the world is immune from soil degradation. It's a global phenomenon. Wherever there's agriculture, there is at least some level of soil degradation. And of course, this is a map of the COVID-19 outbreak showing that also no part of the world where people live has been spared. And another parallel is that both of these epidemics work by disrupting a healthy system. So a virus enters a healthy lung tissue and replicates itself, and then ends up degrading that tissue to the point that its capacity for absorbing oxygen and doing other vital services is compromised. And likewise, a human with a tractor, or even just with a hoe or a plow, can take a healthy functioning system, the soil ecosystem, and turn it into something that's not functioning, that's not providing those ecosystem services that we need in order to produce crops or to produce more soil, to regenerate the soil. So another parallel is that there's a sense of urgency about both of these things, that they can be modeled, that we can predict out in the future that this is going to be a problem that could become extremely severe. So we see people trying to model the outbreaks of COVID, in this case in Moscow, with or without certain interventions. And you know, the world agricultural community has been modeling, and the progress of soil degradation, and is also projecting extremely serious problems in the future if steps are not taken now. And again, another attempt at building up this parallel. What we're talking about for both of these is something that we're really for. Like, we believe in vaccines and we believe in perennial grains, and they're both a kind of biological solution to a problem instead of a pharmacological solution. It's not something where a vaccine enters the body and uses the body's immune system to prevent disease. It doesn't require you know, chemotherapy or drugs or other kinds of surgical intervention over and over again. It's a very elegant solution to an infectious disease. And we believe that perennial grains, with their deep roots, like Abby was mentioning, massive deep root systems actually intervene in the soil and help the soil to heal itself, and the grains themselves can be replanted and planted on new ground. So it's a solution that keeps on solving. It doesn't require constant application of some sort of expensive new thing. Once we can get these grains, they can spread and continue to work without continual new inputs. And another parallel, in both cases, there's a lot of basic biological research. In both cases, we need to collect samples, do some ecology and natural history. And we've also found that modern genomics and genetics and DNA sequencing is very useful for both of these, for developing a vaccine and also for perennializing crops or just doing crop improvement in general. And in the same line, both of these require lab work. This is Abby working in the lab. So they both require basic research, but also kind of clinical trials in the one case, or field trials or greenhouse trials in the other case. So it's a world we're very familiar with. We kind of know what it's like to be developing a vaccine, because developing a new perennial grain is somehow similar. It's a new technology. In the case of vaccines have been made before, but whereas no one has really made a perennial grain before. But there are perennial crops that are extremely important. Olives come to mind, oil palms, sugar cane. There's many perennial crops, so we know it's possible. It just hasn't been tried in the modern era. So that's one difference. Oh, okay, Abby is going to talk about the parallels in sort of political and economic world.
Yeah, so for most technology development in the US at least, there's the private corporations and then the public agencies that work together in some capacity or feed into each other. So typically the public agency takes on the risk of laying the initial groundwork of new research that then gets picked up by private companies to then develop and commercialize that new technology. So in the case of the vaccine, like the US government told the pharmaceutical companies, hey, we're gonna buy X amount of this vaccine at X price to try and get these companies to develop something. And then once that vaccine is developed, hopefully soon, the public agency then figures out how is this gonna be regulated, how is it gonna be distributed, and in what ways is the public going to be educated. So this is paralleling the similar structure in the agricultural field as well. So in the public realm, you have USDA and all the land grant universities that conduct research for themselves and collect germplasm, which can also be utilized by the larger agrochemical and seed companies that commercialize that technology. The public agencies also tend to focus more on the things that are unprofitable, that the bigger companies don't really want to waste their time on, such as soil conservation. And also similar to the public health officials, there are the land grant extension agents that help dictate how this technology is adopted by farmers. So at the Land Institute, we are a little bit different, or very different, in that we are a nonprofit, so we don't really fit into either of those categories. And so that sort of gives us freedom in a lot of ways, that we are mission driven instead of profit driven. So that gives us the flexibility to focus more broadly about deciding how are we going to domesticate this crop and how are we going to distribute or disseminate these new crops. So part of this technology development obviously is public acceptance and trust. This is like really big. We've seen how this has failed in the past. There's been this like strong anti-vaxxer movement and also like a strong anti-GMO campaigns that have sort of been the opposition to a lot of the acceptance of this new technologies that people have been creating. And that's not to say a lot of groups have very valid reasons for this. So oftentimes scientists believe that education is the way to change the minds of these people who are anti-vaccine or anti-GMO. But I really believe that as scientists, like, we must contend with the realities in which marginalized communities have been negatively affected by these technologies. Especially within the medical field, there is a very violent history of pharmaceutical companies and doctors abusing minority groups in the US, which is, I think, a valid reason for people to distrust public health officials and big pharma. And this is also true within the agricultural field. especially in the international development realm. I feel like there are a lot of programs that force or coerce the use of their technology. The example here is in the Philippines, there's a group of farmer peasants called the Masipag Coalition, and they are working to fight against the introduction of golden rice into their foodway. So for those who aren't familiar, golden rice is a GMO rice that is biofortified to have increased vitamin A content to address malnutrition. So it has like this great sort of, we want to fix food insecurity and malnutrition. However, they are not addressing the what the community actually wants. And so in this case, Masipag says it really well on their website, stating that they believe that golden rice is simply a band-aid fix for the malnutrition that is actually caused by poverty and changing food production. So basically, this is all to say that communities need to decide what agricultural technologies they want to employ and shouldn't be forced or coerced upon them, and that there are lots of valid historical and current reasons for marginalized groups not to trust these new technologies, and the scientists, practitioners, policymakers should hear this.
All right, thanks, Abby. So one of the reasons why we chose to do this unusual or first unprecedented comparison of perennial grains as a soil vaccine or an ecological vaccine is that right before the pandemic hit, some of us had just published this paper, or submitted the paper actually, that I'm showing on the screen here. And it came about because we had a big conference about perennial grains in Sweden. And one of the actually Danish participants gave a talk about gene editing, which is kind of the latest version of making GMO organisms, and promoted the idea that with gene editing, we could go out and take plants sort of at random from the forest or jungle or whatever, perennials, and with a little bit of gene editing, basically turn off some of the genes that make them wild and almost immediately have domesticated a new crop, perennial crop. And some of us felt that was maybe oversimplifying the situation, and so we dug into that a little deeper. We're not necessarily against gene editing. We think there may be a time and place for it, but in this paper, we tried to think through what that kind of domestication looks like, because this is, to go back to this vaccine metaphor, this is very much the technological solution. You know, you might think that plant breeding is the technological solution, but gene editing is even more so. It's just trying to change one gene to get something that you want. With one or two genes changed, you could suddenly have a whole new crop. That's the idea. So that's very similar to this idea of taking a vaccine and then tweaking it to make it work for a new disease or a new strain of that disease. So the way we started looking at this is we thought about all the plants that there are in the world. Of course, these ovals are not to scale. And then we're really interested in the ones that people have used and the difference. Why are there some that people haven't used and some that people have used? And okay, so now we're gonna think especially about sort of cultural modes of domestication. So if we look at those same spheres, let's look at all the plants that people have a cultural relationship with, or where cultures have valued or incorporated plants. And we can see that there are some where they're not really harvested, but there are many where people very specifically harvest plants. They have for very explicit reasons, it's part of their culture to do this. And so that's we think, a kind of cultural domestication of plants. Those plants may or may not be changed agronomically or genetically, but the culture has changed. The relationship between the plants and the people has changed. Okay, let's look at another route, which is this blue egg-shaped thing in the middle here. So we're calling that the agronomic route. So people also have taken plants and just started growing them or tending them, cultivating them. And in some cases, they don't really have a particular cultural relationship. It might just be just fodder or something. They may not have names for those plants or something. But in many cases, those are plants, those are the same plants that they already knew, they already valued. And so of course, that's a stronger kind of domestication where it's both a cultural domestication and an agronomic. The farmers are learning how to plant, how to harvest, how to prepare seeds, how to prepare the ground, how to fertilize, and so forth. And then the third route, as you might imagine, is this genetic route. So we know that many plants did change genetically in the last 10,000 years, whether that was deliberately or kind of accidentally as a result of being cultivated and valued. So all the major crops we know of would fit in this area where they changed genetically. People learned how to farm. There's an evolution of culture and of agronomy. People learned how to use them, how to cook with them. They learned and set up trade routes and trade groups and things like that. So now where does gene editing fit into all this? So gene editing is basically over here. We take a plant that no one has any relationship with, potentially, and then move it into this area where it's now we are harvesting it, we're using it, and we've changed it genetically. We've moved it from a completely wild plant into this area where we are cultivating, or we are using it and changing it. But what's the limitation of that is that on its own, just doing that in our opinion, doesn't make it a very highly domesticated plant. It's a partially domesticated attempt because no one knows how to grow it, including the scientists. No one's tried this out on multiple landscapes. We haven't done breeding in the field. We've just done this genetic change in the lab. There's not any value economically for this new crop. There's not any interest. The consumers are not asking for it. So we don't have the cultural piece either. And so without that, the continued economic support of the genetic changes needed to really bring that new gene edited crop into full domestication seems unlikely. And so this is what we were exploring in this paper, thinking that ideally we need all three of these kinds of work to happen to really bring a new crop into agriculture. And so I thought it'd be useful to walk through a couple of cases because we realized in this paper we talk about how different new crops are probably going to take different routes. And so here's an example of Silphium. This is the crop I work with, as you heard about earlier on. So I actually was taking more or less the same route that the gene editing folks want to take. So I took a plant that really there was no evidence people had ever really used it as a food. And I started to use classical plant breeding to change it. So I was trying to feminize it, to increase seed size, to increase seedling vigor, things like that. And we were succeeding. We have been succeeding in doing that. But and then the thought was, okay, well, once we have a plant that's usable and that we've changed somewhat genetically, now we can start bringing it over here and having agronomists learn what fertilizer it needs, what row spacing, should we plant in the spring or in the fall? These kinds of agronomic questions. And then we thought, well, once we've done that, then we can have enough seed that then we can send the seed to people who press oil and people who have restaurants and food scientists. And then we'll invent the cultural uses and we'll have to kind of market it and try to develop a cultural demand for this new thing that no one knows about. So that's the route we have been planning on going. This is the crop I'm talking about, Silphium integrifolium. This is what it looks like early in the spring. If you look underground, it has very deep roots, and so it's quite drought tolerant here in Kansas. Has flowers that look a lot like sunflowers. It's a great host for monarchs and many other insects. this is what some of our breeding plots look like. Here's a feminized head. It has a lot more seeds than these what we started off with. And this is what we're doing. This is our daily work in the summer as we are hand pollinating these crops. And so we bag them to control, to keep the bees out so that we can control which plants get pollinated. And both of these are young scientists who are continuing to work in their are going on to graduate school and now working or starting to work on perennial grains in their graduate programs. So we're really excited about that. And I just wanted to mention something that the Silphium work and all of our work is not just a North American thing. We have really strong relationships in several countries around the world, especially in southern China. So this is in Yunnan province in China, where actually Abby has a deep connection through her father. And I've been there many times visiting our colleagues in Yunnan who are working on some of these other crops, including perennial sorghum and sunflowers or Silphium, but especially on perennial rice. And I'm not going to talk about it. It wasn't part of our paper, but I just can't, I can't not bring it up because it's such amazing work. So they crossed rice with a wild relative of rice that's a perennial, and it's a lot of work. They're looking at a lot of hundreds and thousands of little individual plants to see which ones are perennials, which ones produce seeds. And in about 10 years, they have produced a variety, or several varieties really, that have yields very similar to the annual rice yields. And so this is really exciting work. This is not so much domestication as a kind of perennialization of an existing crop. But we're just really excited about this. And the Land Institute has been supporting this for 10 years because it was work that one of these public institutions that Abby was mentioning earlier began, and then funding changed and they just dropped it. And they put out the word that it wasn't working, that it wasn't a good idea. And one of the scientists working on that in the Philippines came back to the US after they canceled the project and said, no, they're lying to people. It was working. It was succeeding very well. They just, for political reasons, decided to cancel it and tell everyone it wasn't going to work. And so the Land Institute stepped in and started sending Dr. Hu some money just to keep those seeds alive, because he had been in the Philippines working on this. And he came back to China, and we helped him keep that program going, and it's now expanded beyond our wildest dreams. So now I want to briefly go through a couple of other pathways. Let's think about Kernza, which some of you have probably heard about. So Kernza is one of the Land Institute's most well-known perennial grains. It's a trademark that is owned by the Land Institute. The crop itself is not patented, it's just the trademark. And this crop is at the stage of development where farmers are starting to grow it. Not many, but some. And some products are starting to be made from this grain in various places. And so this is kind of our flagship perennial grain. And when we look at this figure, Kernza actually came from a grass that was already being used in North America as a forage. And so it had already been domesticated in several ways. Farmers knew about it. There was seed production. We knew how to grow it, how to fertilize it, how to thresh it, how to clean the seed. But as a forage, it hadn't been bred for bigger seeds. And so we had to sort of move it out of its comfort zone here and change it genetically. And we're still in this process of sort of reconverting it from a forage back into a new crop that's higher yielding, has bigger seeds and that kind of thing. And in so doing, we will also have to redo some of the agronomic and cultural work too. And that's happening with bakers and brewers around the country and around the world now are starting to try to use this grain. And that's extremely exciting for us. Okay, a third example here. is an example on this other side of this figure where a plant is valuable to people, but not cultivated and it's still in a wild form. And yet it has very deep cultural meaning, and this can lead it to be very vulnerable to political and cultural threats. And what I'm talking about is, it's hard to see it here, it's this thistle here. This is our colleague Aubrey. And she and I and Brandon over here and Alex had the great privilege of visiting our colleagues in Palestine earlier this year, in fact, right before the pandemic broke out. And so they were showing us where some of these wild plants grow as weeds, essentially, in areas that are mostly just grazed or maybe in between olive trees. And this is a closer up view of this akub. It's a thistle, basically. And here's some akub in the grocery stores. So it's a very expensive and highly sought vegetable from a perennial. This is a perennial plant, very tough. And the problem now is that it's becoming harder for Palestinians to get access to these wilder lands where they collect it. It's found throughout the Middle East or the Mediterranean area. And here's a paper from some Iranian scientists who were looking at the seeds, and this got us really excited because they believe that the seeds could actually be potentially used as an oil seed. And so we're interested in whether this could be domesticated as an oil seed. But even before that, our colleagues in Palestine are thinking about trying to learn how to cultivate, to encourage Palestinians around the West Bank area to gather seeds and start growing it in their gardens. So taking the first steps from a cultural domestication towards a agronomic domestication, because the traditional harvesting of this crop is now very difficult, given all the checkpoints and the fences and the militarization of the West Bank.
So I feel like this Palestine example is a good segue into talking about how our agricultural systems are deeply embedded in these social and cultural systems as well. And so what I'm really excited to talk about is how scientists can sort of consider these systems while we're also domesticating and creating this new technology. So just to reiterate, we're working on perennial grains. This is our agricultural technology or solution that we're working on. And we are using this technology to protect the soil, and that's great. We really like that. Part of that is also figuring out how this technology is going to serve people and deciding like who is being protected or what systems are being protected or not protected using this technology. And so since we know agriculture is embedded in social and cultural systems, we know that it's within the realm of possibility that Kernza or Silphium or any other perennial grain could be grown in vast monocultures by mostly white male farmers across the Midwest. And that the seeds and access to these plants is tightly controlled by patents or by one or two seed companies, kind of the way that things exist today with corn and soybeans. And this is not necessarily a future that we want. Yeah. And so also within the realm of possibility is that our crops can challenge these systems of oppression by avoiding those things and prioritizing human lives over corporations, expanding the group of people who have access to land and resources, and nurturing these imaginations of foodways that are not inspired by imperialism. And obviously this responsibility of deciding which direction this technology takes is not, does not lie with the plants. It lies with us, the humans, the scientists who have the decision-making power alongside all of our colleagues who are working on policy and the growers and everything else to choose to make a more equitable future. So what makes the EcoSphere TLI really cool is that we have this EcoSphere Studies program that is was created to sort of grapple with these questions and provide space to think about these things. So for those who have worked in like STEM before, I know before I came to TLI, I worked mostly in just regular plant breeding labs where these questions were not asked at all. So that's what really drew me to continue to work here at TLI. And so when I came here as an intern in 2018, the Ecosphere Studies program was hosting a conference where Dr. Jane Mount Pleasant from Cornell spoke at, and she was the one who first planted the seed in my head about re-examining the often used narrative of the problem of agriculture. And I feel like that is something that a lot of people in sustainable agriculture use to like explain why we need to change things. And so sort of re-examining that was really important to me, and sort of expanding my idea of like how I relate to agriculture and how to relate to fixing agriculture or trying to make it better. So Ecosphere Studies is really great in giving the scientists here like the time and space to think about these things. Another component of Ecosphere Studies is the civic science program that Susan briefly talked about. We sent them some Silphium seedlings to grow, and so we've done that with Silphium and a perennial legume that my program is working on, Sainfoin. So we have these two programs where we basically send out our baby plants across the US to people to grow and join our collaborative research network. So this is also another way in which we're trying to rethink about how we're doing science in a more collective way. So one thing that I also wanted to mention that's really important to me is the community that I have here. So with like my friends and coworkers, we get to talk and think about this like reimagination of our food system, but we also get to like physically do it here, which is really cool. And I was talking to David about this earlier. When I was in college and I was applying for internships, I applied to the Land Institute and also Monsanto the same year. And so I luckily was rejected from Monsanto. And so I was able to have this experience of sort of probably what I would not have encountered at Monsanto. But so this is just a collage of some photos across my 3 summers of being at TLI, of these sort of physical things I get to do with my friends of reimagining our food system. And I won't talk about everything, but some of my favorites are that we have, gorilla planted some trees, some fruit trees. We save the seeds from apples and pears that we eat and grow them out in our greenhouse. And then we've planted probably 40 trees in like local parks in Salina. We go dumpster diving, and we make acorn flour, and we have made, I made dumplings, and we made a bunch of pasta out of a lot of the perennial grain flour that we got from work. We made perennial sorghum pasta, perennial wheat pasta, and kernza pasta. It was really good. We participate in our local CSA program, and we support some of the local vegetable farmers here by helping them out with their basically weeding for them a lot of the summers because they don't spray. We go fishing, we pick mulberry trees, and we still have experiences with conventional agriculture. This upper right photo is from a wheat harvest that I got to experience in driving a combine. So yeah, that's just something informal that I get this experience of at TLI that I think is really important.
Great. I'm going to kind of begin wrapping up this talk by forcing you to listen to one of the last paragraphs in that paper I mentioned earlier, because almost no one is ever going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to make you read this last section. Partly because this is my one chance to gloat, because I actually wrote this before the pandemic, and it seems almost, it's really surprising that we were thinking along these lines. But we wrote, in the age of gene editing And at this moment of decision-making about domestication pathways, new food crop domestication might be viewed as analogous to a new public health campaign in all its complexity. Narratives calling for new vaccines are exciting and easily communicated to private and public investors, but advances in vaccine molecules must be accompanied by sustained monitoring of virus evolution, transmission, development of improved vaccine delivery technology, support for clinics and vaccination campaigns, and cultural work towards acceptance and use of vaccines. Investment in novel recombinant or DNA vaccines, which is something that is happening right now for COVID, could accelerate vaccine development or enable vaccination for new diseases like COVID. But this investment will not be worthwhile if vaccines are rejected on cultural or religious grounds, if vaccines are not reformulated to reflect pathogen evolution, and we actually already see COVID-19 evolving, or if vaccines can't be efficiently delivered to vulnerable populations. So what do we mean by public health? It's a very complicated answer. I was really tickled to find this definition of it from a paper in 1920 called The Untilled Field of Public Health, which anytime there's something about untilled fields, people at the Land Institute, we all get excited because we're really interested in how we can reduce tilling. Although I think he's wanting to start tilling this field, but anyway, it's clearly public health. The public health approach is certainly pro-vaccine, but recognizes that the vaccine by itself or any therapeutic by itself is worthless without all these other attempts to reduce risk, to create wellness, to disseminate and distribute any kind of interventions. And so I think we can all agree that we have to invest in all of these things. We cannot just rely on a single breakthrough in a vaccine in the case of COVID. And what does this mean for sort of a public agriculture route towards a new crop, such as a new perennial crop? Well, in the same way, we are going to have to do some genetics and genomics and breeding and things like that, but also it takes a lot of other people, a lot of other kinds of workers and investment and research and subsidies and lawyers and brewers and biochemists and all kinds of people, and especially the farmers and other people who are actually caring for these plants in the soil. And so here was how I summarized that paper. Similarly, recognizing the continuing importance of interacting genetic, agronomic, and cultural drivers to successful de novo domestication, we call on funding agencies, proposal reviewers and authors, and research communities to value and support agroecology, agronomy, plant breeding, and participatory, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary approaches alongside genetics and genomics. So we're not against genetics and genomics, but these are the older, more less sexy, I guess, disciplines in agriculture. And certainly when we bring in the social sciences and things like that, that you don't hear about when you just hear about putting millions of dollars into gene editing or to genomics. But without these other disciplines, that's, in our view, is really wasted research. And so here's, we're getting close to completing this simile, but when we think about what it's taking to develop a vaccine for COVID, in the US alone in 2020, $10 billion have been allocated by the public, by the US government. A lot of that's going to pharmaceutical companies. And that's in the context of a $42 billion National Institute of Health budget. In contrast, perennial grains, for the first time in 2021, we may be getting about $2 million in grants from the government, not the Land Institute, but other partners working on this. 2 million to fix all of agriculture versus 10 billion to develop a single vaccine for a single disease. And to put this in perspective, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, their entire budget is 1.7 billion, not 42 billion. So the US and other countries chronically underfund agricultural research and almost completely unfund any kind of research in new crops or perennial crops, new perennial crops especially. And here I'm trying to address what Susan had asked each of us to address, like how, based on what we're talking about, how could individuals respond? And so I'm going to promote our civic science that Abby mentioned earlier. This is our website. You can go to this website, and the next time we start a new project, you could sign up. So these are individual families that we send plants to, and these guys are planting them. You could personally be involved in our research. They will be collecting data on these plants, helping us decide which ones did better in these different environments. We want to test plants all over the world, but it's starting with the US in rural and in urban areas, in northern and southern areas, in wet and dry areas. We need to know where they grow best, where they have problems. We don't want to be surprised when we start just to roll this out to find a pest somewhere. We want to know ahead of time. And so this is a really, really important way that we can compete with some of the big agricultural companies who have hundreds of test sites all over the country. We don't have that. But if we have hundreds or thousands of people willing to be scientists and to help us get that data, then we can really move ahead. What's the community response, I guess? Well, one example is there are now groovy little restaurants that are making beers, or breweries, I guess in this case, out of kernza, which is our perennial grain. And there's other restaurants and enterprises that are starting to try to use it. So support those local and national companies. Here's another idea. This is Eddie and this is Eric. This is a picture from Argentina. They both came with me to Argentina where we have collaborators. This was from January, and Eddie is a pasta fanatic, and Argentinians are also pasta fanatics. And so he was just in heaven at an authentic pasta restaurant. And of course, Eric is actually, his family is ethnically Italian. So this is a really fun meal for them, but it reminds me of both of these guys are really involved in what Abby was mentioning, like growing out seeds of fruit trees, including pawpaws and all kinds of crazy fruits. And Eddie is the one who has been experimenting over and over again with making pasta from all kinds of things, from acorns, from perennial rice, from perennial sorghum. And then they have a potluck. So here's my suggestion. Have a potlucks, try new foods, invite your neighbors over to help people start learning about new kinds of foods and new ways of eating. And I will also say right now that for me, one of the most important communities that's evolved at the Land Institute is people like Abby. That for many years we felt like we were working alone because there were just a few of us and we had interns come and go. But in the last few years, our program, the research resident program, has allowed people like Abby and Eric and others to stay around. And this is your third summer, is that right? Mm-hmm. So it's been possible for us to develop relationships, and that's really, really meaningful because a lot of times it feels like the work is so slow. I've been doing this for 20 years, and it's hard to say each year that you really accomplished much, but when we can see the enthusiasm and the intellectual growth in people, in Abby and others, that sustains us. And then just national policy, well, I already said we need money, right? If the public should support something, the public has to fund it. We cannot wait for private industry to change our crops. The public is gonna have to pay for it. And I was encouraged to hear on a podcast that Joe Biden has started thinking about deep-rooted plants. And perhaps could initiate some sort of moonshot type program to really launch a change in agriculture. And that would really transform the speed and scope of our work. And finally, sort of our final parallel is that we owe the frontline workers in both of these fields our thanks. We owe, of course, the healthcare workers around the world who are helping us get through COVID, our eternal thanks. And going forward, we already owe the people who grow our food thanks, of course, but many of them are going to be the ones that actually figure out how to use perennial grains and that have to do a lot of the work to grow them and to problem solve. And so it's really important for researchers like us to realize that we have our job, but we are just one small part of the solution. And I want to acknowledge that the other frontline workers are the plants, and especially the roots of the plants that don't get a lot of attention, but this is where a lot of our hope lies, is in really rethinking how crops, the roots of crops and how they sustain the soil and do a lot of work, a lot of the heavy lifting for us as humans. So thank you. And I don't know if we have time for questions. I hope so.
Wow, that was really amazing. Thank you so much, David and Abby. I really, this has been so fruitful and interesting. And I hope you're thinking about writing a book, David. I'm not really.
No, I'm not.
It's such a great framework for thinking about national priorities and how we think about science, and the importance of the sort of long-term systemic work versus quick fixes, which we're very good at. As you say, it's very exciting. Quick fixes are very exciting, but seldom as fruitful as we hope they will be. So anyway, it is 12:42. We are supposed to end at 12:45. We actually are going into lunch at 12:45. So if you and Abby are willing to sit around or be with us for another 15 minutes, maybe we'll at least get some questions. And Sinuan, if you could stop screen share, or I guess that's you, David. Maybe stop.
Oh, sure.
See your face better. You're in Abby's face, and see if we can get you. There you go. So I'll just start with the questions in the box. But I know, again, this has really given me a lot of very interesting things to think about. And I'll say, just in case I don't have time at the end, I also, having been at the Land Institute a couple times now, it's such a thrilling place to be, and it's such a model for organizations like Agraria to try to think about how to fruitfully work with our wonderful young people, and kind of on shoestring budgets really think about how you do long-term work and really value the contributions of interns and everything. So I'm really glad, Abby, that you have joined us and that you had a chance to talk about your intellectual trajectory, because I think we all recognize that the young people are the folks who are going to move us into a healthy future. All right, that's my blah blah blah. Let me have a look at the questions. So Sinuan, who is our amazing intern, how do you see perennial crops transforming agriculture in the US and globally if it were to receive widespread support and adoption? Great question.
Well, it might not be super obvious if you didn't know a lot about crops, because we're trying to find substitutes for a lot of the major crops. So for example, what I work on, Silphium, could basically substitute for sunflower or perhaps canola. Those are oilseed crops. We grow them to produce oils. And perennial rice would substitute for rice, and it looks a lot like rice, and unless you're a farmer, you might not notice. So what would the impact be? The impact would be dramatically lowered rates of soil erosion, improved soil quality, so improved water infiltration and soil water holding capacity. So that can help reduce the fragility of systems, especially with climate disruption. So we believe that perennial crops could be a lot more resilient to short-term droughts and extreme weather events. We also know that perennial crops are much more efficient at taking up fertilizer of any kind. And so currently there's just a lot of waste of fertilizer that just washes down through the soil, and the plants can't get it anymore because their roots aren't there. And so then it ends up in the rivers and ocean, and we get dead zones and things like that. So it's potentially the impacts would ripple through a lot of the ecosystems and really reduce some of the negative impacts that agriculture has, even beyond the farm field.
Thank you. When I think the last time we spoke, you mentioned that when you first started at the Land Institute, that it was really hard to find partners, but now you have a hard time responding to all the inquiries you have. So how do you see yourselves growing this network and this initiative?
Well, one model would be that the Land Institute could become something like a nonprofit Monsanto with, you know, like 2,000 employees and a 20-story buildings and things like that. I think that's unlikely. Probably the model we're more likely to adopt is a network where we can provide some leadership, some funding, hopefully, and you know, obviously networking people to help people join. So we have already plant breeders and other workers in several countries in Africa working on perennial rice. We help fund that work and help them connect with each other and with other funders. And we have collaborators in Argentina and Germany and France and Australia, and of course China and Laos and other countries in on the border with southern China. So a lot of the way that we can expand is by collaborating with researchers, especially at universities, but potentially also at small companies and with individual farmers. And then the other thing is that civic science model that we talked about. We really want to try to scale that up, because right now it's sort of at it's a model stage, it's a proof of concept stage, but to really fund that, we would like to see thousands and thousands of people around the world being able to participate. So for example, in Palestine, we can help advise people on how to do some selection and how to learn how to germinate seeds and things like that. But it would be fantastic if they could network with each other through a online platform, a civic science platform, to have a distributed model for testing and growing and breeding and that kind of thing, and keeping those seeds in a distributed way and sharing them. So we're investing in that. We're building a digital platform that's, we hope will be something like a cross between a iNaturalist and Airbnb or something, where people who have some space, a backyard or a farm that they want to contribute, and people who have projects that they would like help with can connect and get a lot more people involved.
That sounds really wonderful. And folks, if you're interested in connecting with David or Abby or the Land Institute, David's put his email, I think you have, or maybe you haven't, but
it was on that last slide, I think.
Or he could also post it in the chat as well as the website if people feel like they'd like to support your work. We have a question from Dawn Knickerbocker. My concerns about the modification, speaking as an Indigenous person, is number one, how are we being concerned about biodiversity? And number two, how are we being open source about seed stock and avoid the ownership of seed? These are more of questions that always come up for Indigenous people who, as you pointed out, are often left out or maligned.
Do you want to take this one?
Yeah. I'm really glad these questions were brought up. One thing that we didn't really talk about that is pretty crucial to the Land Institute's overall mission is the idea of perennial polycultures. And so me and David have had a lot of discussion about in-field like biodiversity versus regional biodiversity in the agricultural context. And so within my program in the perennial legumes, we're thinking about intercropping and like continuous cover cropping and things like that. But I guess for me, which I think is really great and important, but in terms of like larger scale biodiversity of like sort of addressing the root problem of like, why do we have thousands and thousands of acres of corn and soybean would be more suitably addressed by like this regional agrobiodiversity that me and David have talked a lot about, where like local indigenous foods take center stage instead of these commodities. And so for me, at least, I don't know if I can really speak for the Land Institute, but for me, that's like what is most important is to de-emphasize those commodity crops as they're grown today and re-emphasize the need for like local, like regional food systems where like all this sort of wider host of biodiversity and plants and crops can be can have more attention. And then in terms of being open source about seed stock and avoid the ownership of seed, I feel like this is like my main question as like trying to move forward as learning to be a plant breeder and how to avoid this avoid like having all of the germplasm or patents or technology held within the hands of a very few people. I don't really have any answers to that, but I do have a paper that I've read about like, I think it's by Maya Montenegro about democratizing CRISPR. And I don't know, David, if you have more thoughts about that.
Well, I'll say that until now, the Land Institute has never protected any of the materials that we've worked on. We've always given them to anyone who asks for them. So, and that's more or less, well, now we're starting to ask people to sign an agreement, but it basically requires them to not protect it. You know, they can protect, if they develop something out of it, they can protect it, but they can't keep anyone else from developing something else. So they can't, you know, they can't shut you down, or they can't shut us down or other breeders. So yeah, this is something we think a lot about, and both from just a fairness point of view, but also from a pragmatic point of view, that what we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years is that plant breeding has actually been slowed down by all this IP, the intellectual property, getting lawyers involved. It used to be that plant breeders, especially publicly funded ones, would share very freely. That was part of the culture. And universities started wanting to make money off that, and so they started requiring them to try to protect their new varieties and not share germplasm. And so from a pragmatic point of view, the more freedom we have to share germplasm, the faster we can actually make progress and try to keep up with climate change and evolving pests and pathogens and things like that. And so these are excellent questions.
Yeah,
and it's also, I'll just say one more thing. It's also why the Land Institute wants to stay as a leader in this, because as we succeed, other people are starting to want to sort of take leadership, whether that's universities or, you know, potentially companies or governments, and they don't necessarily have the same values that we have. And so we want to do what we can to sort of stay in the center of this, so that we have some influence over these things about sharing and that kind of thing.
Thank you, David. And we really applaud your leadership both in this, and I know that there's a lot of setting of tables by the Land Institute in regard to soil restoration as an important climate tool. So we're really grateful for all the leadership you show. It was interesting. We had Sally Calhoun from Piscinus Ranch and No Regrets Initiative on here with us yesterday afternoon, and she was noting how a lot of money's now pouring into the field, and that it could be, you know, as water. You need some water, like you need some money, but that more too much money applied indiscriminately could be really damaging for a lot of the work that's going on. So that's a conversation to be continued. All right, I really hate closing up, but I know people need a little bit of a break. Let me figure out, or maybe David, you can see the questions too. Maybe there's one that you feel is a really important or interesting one for you and Abby. And then the rest of them, we can, hopefully people can email you directly or have a look on your site.
Well, Abby is looking at them. I'll invite Dawn to join us and participate through our civic science program. That would be one way that you could have direct control over some germplasm and participation in the process.
Luckily, Dawn is a staff, I shouldn't call you a staff member, Dawn. Dawn is a partner with us now at Agraria, so she has a chance to contribute.
And it looks like Dawn or someone else is asking about hemp. While Abby is looking for other questions, I'll just say, just like 2 days ago, we bought a new thresher from a hemp manufacturing company. So we sort of parasitize the hemp industry because they're very innovative about new kinds of seed processing and greenhouses and things like that. That's our main, I guess, connection with them. They're oddly enough, like a week ago, someone contacted us and said they had found a perennial hemp. And it turns out we all thought that was ridiculous because we all thought that they were all annuals, but it appears that it's possible in a very mild climates and with exactly the right genetics. So I don't think that perennial hemp is gonna save the world, but who knows? That family is a very weird family. It has trees. There are trees that are related to hemp. So who knows?
I just quickly wanted to respond to Sheila's questions. The first one about, we have one field or one study with biochar that I actually helped put together. And that was really crazy because the biochar like came in these huge tons and you had to apply so much of it. And it was actually kind of dangerous because they're really small particles. And so we had to wear crazy PPE. And so that's the only thing I can't really say with the results of that experiment yet. And then your other question that I really appreciated about land access due to high cost and consolidation. Those are some topics that people are beginning to talk about here, especially when it comes to our crop stewardship program, where we have Tessa Peters she used to be called the commercialization manager, but is now a crop steward manager, I guess, working with growers and people. We've started to have those conversations, but I think that's sort of one of the things that we need to have more conversations on, and also probably partner with people about figuring out how to do this together, since we have limited capacity as well. So yeah, thanks for the question though. I think that's really important.
It's important, and one of the things we have to tell ourselves is that we have to trust that other people can help with this problem too. Like, it's not just up to the Land Institute. We're not big enough to solve all these problems. So please join us, please get involved. And there's lots of other organizations that are working on things like beginning farmer programs and land rights and things like that. So support them also.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Abby. Really, and think seriously about that book, David, and keep nagging him about it, Abby. It's a very important message that should be broadly shared. So thank you for really taking the time to put together such a thoughtful presentation, and for being with us. It's a beautiful day here in Ohio. I don't know what it's like there, but thanks for being with us on a beautiful sunny day. And I hope to see you again soon at the Land Institute.